Hi, I'm Wayne Brittenden for the Political Compass podcasts. Today we're talking about Thomas Paine, the British-born father of the American Revolution, no less, and one of democracy's greatest champions, whose extraordinary achievements not only in the US but also France and England have been so woefully neglected. He was also author of 3 of the 18th century's biggest-selling and most influential books. Here to talk with me about Thomas Paine is Paul Myles of Britain's Thomas Paine Society. Paul, welcome to the Political Compass podcasts.
Thank you.
Thomas Paine is an amazingly neglected figure, and I wonder if you can throw some light on why so few Americans seem to have, if not heard of him altogether, then at least know very little about his achievements.
Well, if we're talking about Americans, I have more success with Thomas Paine recognition with them generally than I do English people. Common sense has been required reading.
That's one of his important books, yes.
Yes, that's right. It's required reading fairly early on in the educational system in America. So they're probably most aware, they're aware of him, or they're aware of common sense anyway. But they're not so aware of, because he isn't cited as one of the founding fathers, they're not quite so aware of exactly what he did. And there have been attempts to redress this over the years, but I must say they're usually rather clumsy attempts. We joined in a radio program, a podcast by, I can't remember his name now, but a very famous broadcaster from New York, and he ended up making it all a bit of a joke, actually, which, I suppose all publicity is good publicity, but it was on that kind of level that they seem to have to get it out there. But I think one of the reasons for this is he went against Washington at a critical phase in his own life and wasn't, wholly welcomed back to America. So I think he's been diminished in a sense because he attacked beloved Washington.
So this neglect is deliberate. It's not just an unfortunate occurrence of history.
Well, I think there were 2 factors driven him into obscurity. One is he attacked Washington at that time, and also he wrote Age of Reason. So at the same time as attacking Washington, he attacked what had become or was the fundamental belief system in the United States at that time. Even though they had freedom of religion, it was predominantly Christian, and he attacked organized religion. So I think he done for himself on 2 fronts, as it were, in the popularity stakes.
Let's look at his situation with Washington, and then we'll get into the more general picture of Paine's extraordinary achievements. Wasn't it also Washington's dislike of the Age of Reason, the attack on organized religion, that led to a distancing between Paine and some of the other founding fathers?
Well, he debunked it. He debunked organized religion. Although he was the same as most of the founding fathers, in as much as he was a deist, he did believe in a God. He didn't believe in and he reckons the Christians were the worst of the lot. So I think that was probably a time of where they were looking for stability and growth. Then he was attacking and the new establishment. What Washington felt about it, I don't know exactly, but the reason he attacked Washington is he was wrong, really, to attack Washington. He was mistaken in doing so. There's a story there. He felt that Washington didn't try hard enough to get him out of Luxembourg jail while he was awaiting the guillotine. He was advised that was not so, made the attack, and probably realized his mistake later, actually, but it was a bit late by then.
Right. Well, we're getting into the French territory. He was with the Girondists, and he helped draft the 1793 Constitution, didn't he? So he was an important figure, in a sense, in the French Revolution too, and he did his best to kickstart a revolution in England. Let's go back to Paine's humble origins and see what caused him to become so concerned with the fate of humanity and creating a better world.
Yes, I'm glad you said that. I'll start on that just in a minute, because that's the most important thing to me as well, actually. But just to cover these other periods in his life, the long life he had in three revolutions, really, two successful ones, is that, he had such a long life. It's quite hard to really get your head round the man himself. But you're quite right. What started all this? And I believe that that's what bothered me, actually. I was employed or asked to mount a major festival in 2009 in Lewis, and realised we knew very little about his life there. And then on further research, I found that very little was known about his life before he left for America for the first time in 1774. And even less was known about how does someone as ordinary as he was at that stage, he wasn't from any wealth, he was numerate for sure, and literate, because he was an excise man, but they weren't high status people. So how could, that was a burning question for me, which I spent something like 8 years researching, was how could he, or in fact, how could anybody go from such low status to writing a document that changed the world? And I think the answer lies in, you can see it in his progress through the Excise Service. And so we looked at in detail his movements and the records made in the minute book of the Excise Service and other clues all around it.
For listeners who are not native English speakers, we should just say that that's concerned with customs and duty collection. Is that right?
Yes, the Excise Service is distinct and separate from customs. It's the inland revenue service, whereas customs was to do with the coastal inbound goods. He was a collector for the very unpopular excise duty, which was duty on soap, tallow, beer, lots of different things, window taxes at some point. And it was, curiously, the Excise Service was a part of the civil service. His boss was the King George III, actually. It came under, he paid his wages and the money went to the government, who then reapportioned it out. But so that's what he did. He went through rigorous examination to become an excise officer. He would have had to take some fairly serious oaths to the crown. And but it was within that service he discovered the corruption of England at that time.
That was the beginning of his speaking out on so many injustices and wrongs, right?
Yes, indeed, it was. In fact, he was selected to speak out on these injustices by George Lewis Scott, one of the commissioners of excise and previously teacher, tutor, preceptor to King George III in his minority. And so it's a very curious juxtaposition between someone very ordinary and someone very high up in society. And Paine was used to voice the concerns of his fellow 3,000 excisemen with regards to corruption and regards to unfairness, orchestrated by someone of very high status, a commissioner of excise, who was himself brought in to root out corruption in the excise service.
So he became friends with Benjamin Franklin, who was based in London at that time. How did that friendship come about?
The introduction came from George Lewis Scott. Paine says that himself. You can find that evidence in a letter. So after writing the case of the officers of excise and obviously getting to know George Lewis Scott and going to London from Lewis, Paine was introduced to Benjamin Franklin. We don't know exactly where and how, but he was certainly introduced to him at that point, a very important connection.
And at that time, Paine had begun writing his pamphlets?
Well, at that time, Paine had completed his first pamphlet, He hadn't really written anything before then, apart from a couple of letters from the Sussex Weekly Advertiser, which, we discuss. Again, you can see his humanity, you can see his reasoning. The case of the officers of excise is his first writing. It's a substantial document for which he was employed to do, or appointed to do, by one of the 9 commissioners of excise from London, to put the case forward for two things: for a rise in pay, it had been frozen for 100 years, and for other conditions to be met to make the excise men's life so that they wouldn't be driven to corruption. Paine argued that they had to be corrupt in order to survive and feed their families.
Now, when did his first book come out? Because that caused a sensation. That would have been The Rights of Man or Common Sense?
It's Common Sense. He left England in 1774, arrived in Philadelphia, and quite soon became an editor of the Pennsylvania Packet, in which you can start to see, we can track some of the writings that he'd written already in England, little poems and so on and so forth. But his first major document is Common Sense, in which he attacks King George III, the unfairness and the corruption of the old country, which he knew very well indeed, because he'd been working in the Excise Service. He knew it inside out. And it's that document, Common Sense, which launches him into the fact that we're talking about him now.
The Americans responded very positively to Common Sense, didn't they?
Yes, they did. It was hugely successful. And, there are lots of facts and figures and well-documented numbers around that. It sold more than the Bible did at the time. It was read by everyone. It was read out to everybody. And I think the War of Independence would have happened anyway. I think what Paine did was kindle it. He fanned the flames, if you like, and accelerated the program, the whole business, the revolution. So he was very, and not only Common Sense, the 13 crisis papers that he wrote afterwards to steady the troops during the war were incredibly important. And it's in I think it's crisis paper number 3 that he first coins the phrase, the United States of America. And he cited, there's little phrases from these crisis papers that pop up in so many presidents' inaugural speeches. He's oft quoted by the left, by the Republicans and the Democrats, actually. They both claim him. And you hear it time and time again, and many of these phrases are familiar. These are the times that try us all, and a few others are very common in the American parlance now.
You mentioned him being claimed by all points on the political spectrum. In Agrarian Justice, 1797, he looks pretty clearly like a man of the left, because he talks about what essentially is the beginnings of a welfare state. He wants welfare for students and young people, and he wants old people looked after as well. That's pretty revolutionary for the time, isn't it?
Yeah, sure, for sure. And I think what predates Agrarian Justice is Rights of Man Part 2, where he does lay out the template for a state to look after its people. So a social state, if you like, where people are looked after from cradle to grave in a way of being fair. We'd had enclosure in England by that time, and a lot had been taken away from the people. Common areas of ground had been taken away. Oliver Goldsmith famously writes in The Deserted Village. So that notion was very clear in England at that time. And of course, later in Agrarian Justice, he laid it out. If land is going and resources are going to be taken away from us, then they ought to be apportioned back in other ways. So yes, a very important set of calculations by Paine, and for the first time, right and left not really existing then, but the first time he lays out fairness.
Common Sense, did that get to the UK? Did Paine have some cozy relationship with a clandestine publisher?
It is tradition that King George III read a copy. Certainly, it would have Price and Priestley and other people that supported America or the idea of America and thought that England was unfair at the time would have been aware of it. But I would say not wholesale distribution here. It was more for America.
Looking at Paine's incredibly progressive mindset, I'm thinking about capital punishment. He was against capital punishment. I don't think many people were in the 18th century, were they?
Well, that's how he ended up in Luxembourg jail. He argued to keep the king's head on his shoulders. Rather than kill him, that he should be sent to America and made to work on the field. So, yes, I mean, Paine is a very progressive thinker, very logical, and I believe, speaking as an atheist, he must excuse me, if he'd have been born 20 years later, he would have been an atheist as well, I think. The knowledge wasn't really there. Lyell hadn't come along. Darwin hadn't written his book. So, but he was at the vanguard of progressive knowledge, scientific knowledge. He was very, very interested in it, as was Franklin as well.
And yet, if he had written in an Ivy League sort of way, he wouldn't have been half as dangerous to the establishment. It was his popular language and his knack of talking to the common people, of whom, in fact, he was one, that was probably the undoing of him with the establishment. They were threatened by him in a way that a heavily academic writer would have been left to his own devices.
Well, this is the thing. We figured it out. I mean, I had a series of seminars in my research with some leading historians here, and we figured out, and I think it's fairly common knowledge, that one of Paine's skills is talking to the everyman. But also there's another, if you like, writing or linguistic device embedded in his writing, is that it's written to be read out. So it really is an oral thing. Many people couldn't read at that time, and it was quite common for newspapers to be read out and pamphlets to be read out in public spaces. And the more you think about that, and the more you read it, and the more, if you actually say it out loud, it flows. His words flow in a way. And whether he worked on that or just had a natural aptitude, I don't know. But that's what he did. And power of that is as direct now and as understandable now as it was then. It's as easy to read and as easy to listen to as any modern writer.
Let's get him away from America then. How did he manage to get to France? What was the motivation, and how did a man of limited economic means manage to make the journey? Especially important because he didn't speak French, did he?
No, he was collected. I mean, this is after the peace treaty has been written with America by Franklin in France, actually. Paine has designed the bridge. He's come back to London. He's stirred in London by the French Revolution and writes in its defence in Rights of Man Part 1 and Part 2. At that time, the English government were very frightened of a revolution here. Paine was supporting the French Revolution in Rights of Man Part 1 especially. And so, therefore, he was pilloried, he was hounded here and just about to be prosecuted for it. So, but it's not true that he was hounded from the country. He was collected from London by Mr. Audibert, an official of Calais, to collect, and he went to London and collected him and took him to Dover and took him across to Calais, where he was lauded as a hero. He was hounded eventually from Dover and spat and hissed at. And there's very good accounts of this. I have transcribed the spy's account of this, the government spy's account of this. I found it in the archives and published it in one of their past journals. So he wasn't warned. Yes, it's wonderful. And it describes Paine. It's one of the very few descriptions of Paine, actually, as he gets on the boat. And he was unkempt and untidy, and he described as a drunken tailorman who'd been playing bowls for 3 days and nights without sleep. So, it was very hard to get your eye on Paine, but that was one moment which wasn't written for the public. It was written as a spy for Whitehall. And Paine gives his own account of that incident as well, which maps pretty closely, so you can be sure that's what happened. Obviously, he doesn't run himself down, but there he go. Off he goes. He's collected, and it becomes the first. Is he an Englishman then? Is he an American? And he becomes, anyway, whether he's an Englishman or an American, he sits on the Council of the French Revolution. I mean, it's extraordinary position.
Tell us about his falling out with the key revolutionary figures.
Yeah, well, it was Robespierre, the terror came upon, and it was at this point that Paine started to feel uncomfortable with the amount of death, and that's when he lobbied not to cut the king's head off, so he was jailed along with anyone else who looked the wrong way at that time. So he just got swept up in it, really. But it was the Robespierre. There's some very good books on this, actually. Robespierre period of terror. And the only reason he escaped was, and this is again in Paine's own words, is that they went round the night before and marked a cross on the door for the next one for the guillotine. But Paine was sick at that time, and his door was swung open, and they put the cross on the door, and when it was swung shut, he rubbed it off, and so thus escaping the guillotine.
How did he escape? There must have been a lot of American help there.
Well, he gets American help in the end. There was a governor, now I get a bit confused, there's two M's here, but the first governor Paine hated, or the plenipotentiary, not the governor, the plenipotentiary, the ambassador to Paris, Governor Morris, didn't like Paine because Paine whistleblowed him for corruption early on in the American Revolution, and that turned out to be true. And then the next guy in was friendly towards Paine, and Paine liked him, and he eventually argued to get Paine out. So he was helped eventually.
And he gets back to America, and he isn't settled there very long, and upsets the Plymouth Rock lot by coming out with the Age of Reason, an attack on organized religion and Christian dogma.
Well, he wrote Age of Reason in jail, so it hadn't really hit by then.
He brought a completed manuscript back to the United States.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I'm a little bit muddly in my mind about the exact timing, but I know he finished it in jail, so I guess it wasn't released until after he got out. And so he did the two things that sort of we were talking about earlier, which was he was seething about Washington and wrote that letter after he got out, and also Age of Reason was published as well. So both those things did for him, but he had time to think in there, clearly.
There's a lot of wit in his writing, particularly I find in the Age of Reason. Typical of that is his discussion about the book of Revelation. He said, take Revelation, it's only revelation for the first person. After that, it's merely hearsay.
Yeah, I know, he's so good. I think it was a device as well. I argue, actually, I'm about to argue a bit more, that Paine learnt that bit of writing style from the Sussex newspaper, the Sussex Advertiser, or the Lewis Journal, which he contributed to while he was in Lewis. The editor, William Lee, published the case of the officers of excise. I'm pretty sure it was Lee who introduced him to George Lewis Scott. But the newspaper, which I'm analysing at the moment, it's a work in progress, it's a long job, I've digitised it and I'm working through the articles. It's so funny, it's so witty and lively, and it really is the finest, sharping, acerbic wit is the best way of attacking the establishment. They've learnt that, and they revel in it. You know, there are waves of witticism, if you like, in all the articles in the newspaper, which runs hot during the time that Paine is in town. So I think Paine learned his craft there, actually. He's a craftsman writer, and he learnt the craft of wit there as well. And you had some, and Voltaire was witty, you know, Rousseau, who wrote The Fable of the Bees, that was witty. You know, so that was about at that time, but it's big in the newspaper. Lots of short, sharp, witty articles, and you can see this. Paine uses this device time and time again. It's wonderful.
We know that the French were ready to execute him. The British would have executed him if they'd had a chance. The Americans simply deserted him.
Yes, I kind of looked into that a bit. I think it's 50-50. I think half the population, went with the popular view, the popular view being not many people think about it too much and just go along with it. But I think people who knew him and were thinkers stayed with him. He still had friends in America. And one of the things about being involved in this Thomas Paine, the study of Thomas Paine, is you spend a lot of time defending him. And it's because the first book about him by George Chalmers, he was employed by the Pitt government to write the first biography, The Life of Paine, and he attacks him at every turn. And he's quite an accurate researcher, but he doesn't miss a chance to malign Paine's character. And then you had Cheetham doing the same in America, and Rickman doing it, but not incredibly well, defending him, his old mate who wrote The Life of Paine, in his defence. And we've been defending him ever since. And we used so much energy in defending Paine that, and dealing with that, the curiosity of him being hated, that a lot of his really good work gets perhaps not. And I'm guilty of this. I spend a lot of time in the Thomas Paine Society UK defending Paine, which is, it's kind of exhausting in a way. Whereas, really, it would be nice not to have to defend him, if you see what I mean. But perhaps it's because of this state that he is sort of so interesting, because he forever feels undiscovered. Because first you have to understand him, then you have to defend him, and then you can think about him a bit more. It's a very odd set of literature, actually, and his character is somewhat hidden.
I understand your frustration of having to defend him, but another frustration must be having to explain who he was, because he's been so neglected by history.
Well, that's right. I mean, he's been neglected by history because he was attacked so much. And some of that I even get, because Napoleon said a golden statue of Thomas Paine should be erected in every town in England. There was a period where Paine thought Napoleon Bonaparte was the answer. He obviously realised that he was not the character he thought he was later, and came away from Napoleon. But it's hard to defend Paine in England when you do have that element, you see.
That absence of statues to recognise the man who in effect shaped mindset today about human rights is astonishing. You go outside the British Parliament and there's Cromwell, who in fact was a mass murderer, honoured with a statue. There's Nelson in Trafalgar Square, no Thomas Paine to be seen.
Yeah, it's bizarre. And the trouble is, again, back to the popular thing, we've got it in spades in this country at the moment, in England at the moment, is the popular thing. And you're a political organisation, talking about politics, your organisation, you must be keenly aware that most people don't think at all. They just snatch the low, what's given to them most. It's the iteration that's important, not the truth. And so Paine, there we are, laid out like a spreadsheet, the iniquities or the failures of the British people to think even.
Let's look at Thomas Paine in his period of isolation and old age in the United States. How did he die, and who noticed?
He died on it. Oh, yes, his death's quite interesting, actually. I walked there. It's in Bleecker Street. He spent some time with, I'm struggling to remember this now. I don't write about this, but I researched it. It's a good thing to do, is to walk those bits of New York, because the spots are still there. He stayed with his old friend William Carberry, who was a blacksmith from Lewis. He was a boy when Paine was there. And they argued. He lived there for some time in his dotage, and they argued. Paine was a heavy drinker at that time. I think he's quite an uncomfortable person to know at any stage of his life, actually. And they fell out, and then he was removed from there, and I think he ended up in lodgings and died pretty much alone, actually. His body then being carted up to New Rochelle. It's quite a long way. I've made that journey. And buried up there. with not many people at his grave. But he didn't die he didn't die short of money, Paine. He was quite a wealthy man at the end.
Didn't the Americans give him some land?
They did, yeah. I've been on that land. They gave him a little farm and a house up at New Rochelle there. It's very nice. They've moved the house, actually, but it's still there. And there's a memorial there, but the bones aren't on there. Cobbett dug them up and took them back to England, but that's another story.
Didn't he lose some of them at the time? Didn't
Sorry?
Paine's bones get lost by Cobbett?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, Cobbett brought them back, and we don't know where they are. We get the occasional claim that they're found, but we can't. Actually, I have found not a descendant of Paine, but I found a descendant from Paine's uncle. So if bones do turn up now, we can check.
Okay, and Cobbett was a like-minded person. We should just let our listeners
know.
Was.
He was, yeah. He ended up loving Paine, and quite an important person in his own right, William Cobbett. And we did think we'd found the bones, actually, because I was doing some research, and there's a museum up where Cobbett lived, in Surrey there, Dorking. And the curator of the museum rang me up, and he said, "I found a casket that says Paine's bones written on it." So we skedaddled up there, but it wasn't. There was nothing in there.
If you could meet Thomas Paine today, what would be the first question you'd want to ask him?
I'd like some more detail about the corruption in the Excise Service. I'd like to know more about. I'd like to nail where he got his ideas from. When he started burning with injustice, I'd like to know exactly that. Because the later stuff, you can plot his progression through his writing, okay?
Yes.
But the early stuff, I trained as a psychologist later in my life. And I like due process. I like looking for process. So there's just some missing bits. I mean, I cover it in the book. I find as much as I can, but I'd like to hear it from him.
Well, he had a Quaker mother, and that Quaker social conscience and dislike of fundamentalist dogma might have had some bearing on Paine's early life, don't you think?
Yes, certainly. The father's Quaker, the mother's Anglican.
Oh, okay.
So that's okay. And so father was asked to leave the Quakers because he'd married Frances Cock, the Anglican woman, which is Paine's way into the Excise Service in a way. Actually, he couldn't have done that as a Quaker. But yes, certainly he would have carried his father's ethics for sure, no doubt about it. Well, I think that's fundamental. Yeah, he asked to be buried in a Quaker graveyard in America after his death. They refused him, but he obviously held that dear. Yes, I agree.
Paul, your two books, Thomas Paine and Lewis, and The Rise of Thomas Paine in the Case of the Excise Officers, is available through our website at Amazon. And I want to thank you for your dedication in raising the profile of an incredibly great man, one of the Enlightenment's true heroes. So please go on doing what you're doing. We need Thomas Paine, and we need you to remind us of him.
You're very kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.